Nahla Abdo is an Arab feminist, political activist, and a professor of sociology at Carleton University, Ottawa. She has extensive publications on women, racism, nationalism, and the state in the Middle East, with a special focus on Palestinian women.
Thank you. Many thanks to the organizers of this important event. And believe me, those who are not with us don't know what they're missing. I'm really happy to be among these great, powerful women as well. If you remember, Laila Khalid mentioned something about occupation, but she, of course, qualified it in terms of occupation of Palestine. We all here in our public consciousness, as well as in the media, as well as in the official dealings, the talk is about occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and the deal, or what seems to be going around between Kerry and Netanyahu, is some sort of an arrangement to solve the conflict in the Middle East, or solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as if by ending Israeli occupation of 1967 in the interest of Israel is going to solve the problem. I think this whole issue of occupation is just a camouflage to the real history, and anyone who talks about occupation in this sense, I think, does not know the whole history of Palestine and the Palestinians. Plus, the solution is going to be the wrong solution. It's not going to be a just solution. Speaking Palestine, or the Palestinians, or Palestinian women, is very much a feminist concern. And we all know that, but I'll try to explain a bit more. We need a little bit the context in order for us to understand the struggle of Palestinian women. My task was extremely tremendous, and I don't think I can serve it any justice because I don't have that much time. My task was to talk about the struggle of Palestinian women, past, present, and future. So I will try very briefly, actually, to begin with the context historically, and pause mainly on important periods, if you want, in terms of their implication on the struggle of Palestinian women. I begin with a 1994 quote from Edward Said, where he says, "We are at a point in our work when we can no longer ignore the empire and the imperial context in our work," and I would add, in our studies, he says, and I would add, in our activities. Like my colleague here said, imperialism is something that we cannot ignore in understanding the source of oppression, all forms of oppression, and particularly women's oppression. This quote was 20 years ago. Today, 20 years later, the quote remains pertinent, and many decades before the quote was, or the saying, or the phrase was also proper, albeit imperialism at the time took different forms, the form of colonialism, the form of settler colonialism. So as I said, in order for me to do a bit of justice to the Palestinian women's struggle, I would begin with a brief context of the history of Palestine. We all know, and probably you know most of this context, but briefly, that the Zionist movement began as quote-unquote national movement for the Jews, emerged in the West, particularly in Britain, as part of the Western national movement, and began to invest in Palestine, late 19th century. But its actual implementation and its meaning, as far as Palestinians were concerned, was not really a national, but rather a settler colonial movement. And that implementation came after all of you know, after the Balfour Declaration, and particularly after 1920, with different arms of the Zionist movement, including the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, including the Jewish Agency, including the Histadrut, which was supposedly the workers' union, but it was the capitalist union as well, if there is such a thing as capitalist union. In other words, it serves as as the employer and the server for the employees. And this is why, guys, don't believe it if they tell you the Histadrut is a union. It's not. It's the double thing, actually. And, you know, they started with the settlements between 1920 up to 1948 in a form that was known as tower and stockade. That is, building tall settlements, basically on the hills of Palestine, that is, areas that are relatively overlooking Palestinians and on borders. So the Galilee was, the Galilee was the first sort of, because it's a hilly place, the first one to be literally colonized, and of course the plain because of its agricultural product. Another important point here is that we are often told that the Jews bought land from absentees, Arab absentees, particularly those who lived in Lebanon. Let us all remember that the First World War, which is the imperialist war which divided the world, and particularly the Middle East at the time, Palestine was part of something called Greater Syria. That is, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria were together as one territorial continuity. And that oneness was split between the imperial powers during the 1920s. France took Lebanon, and the British took Palestine, and Syria was taken by the French, right? Which means that those who were landlords in Palestine, now they are absentee landlords. They are in Lebanon and could not go to Palestine. So they would auction their land, and those who had money or extra money or more money than the Palestinians there would buy that land, and that was JNF as well as other Jewish agencies. Remember, Palestinians during that time, actually over 80% of them were peasants, and mainly middle to lower peasants. That is basically surviving from land to mouth. So this was the early presence, or the early period where Palestinians became impoverished. The imperial power, that is Britain, made sure that Palestinians who would not pay taxes or tithe at the time would be imprisoned, and their small pieces of land will be auctioned. And in auction, again, the JNF as well as other parts of the Zionist movement were able to acquire that land. In other words, there was, unlike what a lot of the history, the written history that we have now, that the Jews bought the land from the market. Actually, a good part of that land was taken via the support of the colonial state at the time. Then we have 1948, and we all know about 1948. 1948 is the year of the massacre, the year of the expulsion of around 80% of the Palestinians. Some authors refer to this 1948 as, for example, Ilan Pappé refers to it as ethnic cleansing. Others, including myself, refer to it as forms of genocide. Cultural genocide, definitely. Territorial or geographic genocide, absolutely. And also economic genocide. Because what you have here is you kick the people from their homes, from their property, from their resources altogether, and you control all of these. And you send them outside, expel them by force. Not only by force, but also through massacres and rape. In my recent book, actually, I quote one particular British officer who witnessed one such an atrocity, and this is around a village that I'm sure you have heard of, the massacre of Deir Yassin, 1948. This is what he says. The Deir Yassin massacre, which was to become a prominent chapter in the collective memory of Palestinians, has received a great deal of attention by Palestinians, by Jews, and by others, including so many writers. The following graphic description of the massacre, based largely on eyewitness accounts of the massacre reported by a British official and by Jacques Deranier of the International Committee of the Red Cross, is a reminder of the deeply racist and hate-mongering attitudes towards indigenous Arabs held by the Zionist settler movement in Palestine. The massacre at Deir Yassin took place on the 9th of April, 1948. According to Martin, of the 250 people killed, there were 25 pregnant women were bayoneted in the abdomen while still alive. 52 children were maimed in front of their mothers, then slain and beheaded. Their mothers were in turn murdered, their bodies and sexual organs subsequently mutilated. 60 other women and girls were also killed and mutilated. Quoting British Army officer Richard Catlin, who was present at the scene, Martin writes, "There is no doubt that many sexual atrocities were committed by the attacking Jews." These are his words. "Many young schoolgirls were raped and later slaughtered. Many infants were also butchered and killed. I also saw one old woman who had been severely beaten about the head with rifle butts. The involvement of Ashkenazi female pioneers," and why do I say pioneers? Because this is how Ashkenazi women who settled in Palestine during that first period were referred to as pioneers. In this massacre, these females have a direct bearing on. Okay, let me say something about these Ashkenazi pioneers. The gang, he continues, was young, men and women, armed to the teeth, and had also cutlasses in their hands, most of them still blood-stained. A beautiful young girl with criminal eyes showed me hers still dripping with blood. She displayed it like a trophy. This was the cleaning up team that was obviously performing its task very consciously. This is just one incident, actually, that is not heavily quoted or known about the Yassin massacre. Okay, 1948. Between 1948 and 1966, you have over 80% of the Palestinians expelled totally from their land, becoming refugees, mainly in the neighboring Arab countries, and 20% of Palestinians remained in Palestine. These 20% actually were concentrated in three major areas in Palestine, one called the Galilee, another one called the Triangle, and the third one called the Naqab, or the Negev. You probably are hearing now more about the Negev and the attempts by Israel to expropriate all the land in the Negev and destroying the shacks or homes of the Bedouins in the Negev. And you probably are hearing something about land swaps. The land swaps refers to the area called Triangle, where Israel is willing to give part of the people on that part actually, give it to the authority, that is to the PA in the West Bank, while taking the land as part of the deal that Kerry is carrying with him. So, and the Galilee has been since then actually heavily attacked by expansionism, land expansionism, with what Israel refers to as Judaization. That is making the rest of Palestine Jewish land. in order for Israel to become the Jewish state. Because Israel cannot become the Jewish state where you still have 20% of its population Palestinians, like myself, who does come from that part of the world. And then after that, we all are aware of further expansionism by this settler colonial expansionist state, Israel. That is 1967, where the rest of Palestine was occupied and placed together, and more lands from other Arab countries, including the Golan Heights, Syria, as well as parts of southern Lebanon, as well as parts of Jordan, and parts of Egypt, as you probably know, all were occupied in 67. There was some sort of a deal with Sadat about Egypt, and but still there is one area that both the Israelis and the Taba area actually and the Egyptians are still working together in it. This context is important for us to be able to understand the types or the different types of struggle that Palestinian women have led. In other words, actually, I would like to begin by saying that Palestinian women's struggle is as old as colonialism is. Also, there are periodizations. We can very briefly say that 1920 up till the mid-30s, the main struggle in Palestine was concerning the land grab by the Zionists, was concerning the Balfour Declaration, and was concerning what basically was the shock actually of the majority as to how their conditions are deteriorating. One of the British officials has declared actually in 1929 already that the majority of Palestinian peasants have become impoverished as a result of the imprisonment and taxation of the colonial state and the taking away of their lands from them. The kind of struggle that women have led actually was largely a class struggle, that is middle and sort of upper class women have held several demonstrations, sit-ins, petitions against Balfour Declaration and petitions against the Zionist encroachment at the time. Things changed between mid-30s and after that. In 1935, 1936 actually, Palestine knew, if you want, its first guerrilla war, its first revolution. Women, and mostly peasant women here, have taken part in this, partly as supportive, but also partly carried weapon as well. Transported weapon, carried weapon, and had a strong presence. These are peasant women, a strong presence in the 1936 onward revolution. 1967, we know what happened in 1967. And we have a situation whereby the Palestinians, the 20% of Palestinians from 1948 up to 1966 were under military rule. In other words, you could not move from, let's say, my city Nazareth and drive even 10 minutes away from Nazareth. You could not move from one city, one village to one village to connect with your family or the rest of your family without the permission of the military ruler at the time. So there was a total isolation. The people who were in the Naqab were in the Naqab, totally isolated. The people who were in the Triangle, the same way. The people in the Galilee were very much, even within the Galilee itself, which was a large sort of concentration of Palestinians, even there you could not move from one place to the other. You needed a permission by the ruler at the time. Palestinians did not, inside Israel, at the time where, until 64, until the emergence of the PLO, these Palestinians worked and held or established, if you want, a movement called Harkat al-Ard, that is the land movement, established by Palestinians inside, and the whole idea of it was to definitely oppose the Israeli policies. Now, Harkat al-Ard, or the land movement, was attacked. People that were part of it were put in prison, and then al-Ard went under al-Ard, that is underground. Okay, 1960s until 1980s is a very important period in the periodization, if you want, of the Palestinian women's struggle. We don't know much about it, but we do know about Layla Khalid. Layla Khalid, it was during this time, 1969 as well as 1970, she hijacked the two planes, right? So the world heard about this young, beautiful woman, Audrey Hepburn, this is how they refer to her, who was terrorist, right? So we knew about this terrorist. But to begin with, by the way, Layla Khalid was not the first one. A woman I met for my current research was the first one. Her name was Amina Dahbour, and her hijacking was 1986, and later 68, sorry, and later I might quote something from her because I had an oral history with her 2 years ago. But during 60s and 80s, there were hundreds of Palestinian women from the West Bank and Gaza who became political detainees. Many of them were charged for what do you call it? Sentences for life, and one of them, or two of them actually, this woman here, that you have her picture, Rasmiya Audi, received, I think, 4 or 5 life sentences for an armed struggle that she was involved in on the Palestinian land, but against Israeli soldiers. Aisha Audi received 3 life sentences as well. Now, Rasmi, Aisha, and various others were actually freed only through exchanges between, the different, between the PLO and the Israelis. And there were other exchanges where other important forces have been involved in. Okay, I want to pause a little bit around this area, 1960s, 1980s, partly because I'm proud of what I did, my research, and the book will come out actually in August around the armed struggle. And I focused on that one because I think there was a lot of work, a lot of studies that have been done around the Intifada. I mean, there's no one who doesn't know what the Intifada is. Even our media is, proud to tell us more about the Intifada, especially the first Intifada. The 60s until the 80s was a totally lost type of period, and not many people knew what was happening, especially in Palestine. I said they knew Layla Khalid, but they didn't, as a terrorist, of course, and not as a freedom fighter. But they didn't know what other freedom fighters who called themselves Munadilat, and there were in the hundreds actually, what they have been doing there. Why did this movement emerge? Partly because of the impact of the international scene. It was a revolutionary moment, as you were mentioning earlier. 60s until the 80s, all over the world. This is part of it. And there was a plethora, actually, of writings around resistance writings. In Palestine, we had what we call resistance poetry and prison poetry. That is, poems, and tons of them that were written around political imprisonment and around resistance. What I would like to do is just give you one sample of the resistance, poetry of resistance actually, and prison poetry. Just, I don't know when the flag of 5 minutes is going to. Now? Okay. I thought so. Okay, here is Mahmoud Darwish, I'll try to do it fast. We are standing here, sitting here, always here, eternal here. We have only one goal, to be. After that, we differ on everything. On the shape of the national flag. We also differ on the words of our new national anthem. We also differ on women's responsibilities. About the latter, he also adds, you will do good, my people, if you are well, my people, if you choose a woman to head the national security. Or, this is a message to Israel. All those who pass between fleeting words, carry your names and be gone. Steal what you will from the blueness of the sea and the sand of memory. Understand that which you will never, how a stone from our land builds the ceiling of our sky. As for us, we have to water the martyrs' flowers, live as we will, leave our country, everything, and leave the memories of the memory. Tawfiq Zayyad, another one of the resistance poets. فلتسمع كل الدنيا, let the whole world listen or hear us. We shall never submit to the power, the phantom, the cannon. We shall starve, go naked, sliced into pieces. And we eat soil, but will never surrender. He continues his defiance by declaring that he shall write everywhere in Palestine that Palestine was occupied. It became free. And the occupier, the usurper, it became a memory. This was the environment, the internal, if you want, or national environment of resistance that very much impacted the women who led the struggle 1960s and 1980s. Very powerful messages that came internally and externally for them. The Intifada is, once again, something that we all have heard about. Popular resistance by men, women, and children, and the weapon at the time was the stone. But even the stone, it was for Israel lethal weapon that ended up in tens of thousands of women imprisoned as a result of that. But it was a 3-4 year actual situation, created a kind of, if you want, community, solidarity. A mother could claim any kid to be hers without knowing him at all, just to save him or save her actually from the occupiers. Struggle of Palestinian women, to conclude, has been as long as British colonialism, as Israeli settler colonial occupation of Palestine, whole Palestine. Future, one word. There would be a future for both Jews and Palestinians without something called Israel as a Jewish country, but with a country that is democratic and just for both peoples. Thank you.